What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are going to explain the ending of Moon Knight Episode 4, because I feel like this really is confusing to a lot of people, but the way that it's handled is brilliant. They're kind of doing it the opposite of how it would normally be handled, but it's still cool nonetheless. So obviously there's going to be spoilers here, but near the end of the episode, this is more like an ending sequence explained, but near the end of the episode, Mark Spector, or basically the body of Mark and or Steve Grant, is shot by Arthur Harrow. And then at that point, he kind of dies, but not really. It looks like he goes more to what's basically a way station or like a purgatory before he actually goes on to the afterlife. Again, we're not really given any definitive answers here, but there is some similarity in terms of what's going on, because there's obviously differences between this and like Jeff Lemire's run, but there's a lot of very similar things in the storyline. What is it? Welcome to New Egypt, I think is what it was called. I know the second one is called Life, Birth, and Death, I think, or maybe just Birth and Death. But the important thing here is this. Once Mark Spector's shot, he ends up in this kind of purgatory place. That what's really cool in the way this is handled, albeit a little, I wouldn't say sloppily, that you kind of have this whole sequence with Arthur Harrow. Now, right off the bat, this gave me Legion vibes, right? It felt like something from Legion. The difference here is that Legion had a far more extensively crafted aspect of whether or not David Haller was crazy or if he was really in an asylum. You didn't really know exactly what was going on. Granted, they had more than like 15 minutes to kind of craft this whole narrative. So I get what they were going for to a degree, because once he basically wakes up in this asylum and then like he's talking to himself, believing he can talk to Steve, but Steve's not answering him. So it's basically just Mark in there by himself. His girl's there. You end up seeing Donna there, which, fingers crossed, she died. She was a prick. You have all these different people seemingly from like the life of Mark Spector, right? The people that we've seen so far, some of whom we presumably haven't seen but have been a part of his life, that they're all basically there. And that ultimately he ends up waking up again in the office of Arthur Harrow, having previously been sedated. And basically Arthur Harrow doesn't necessarily come out right and say it, but basically he hints at this idea that like Mark Spector struggles with schizophrenia. Now, one of the things to know is this is somewhat old hat. Jeff Lemire did revisit this in his comic book run to a degree, but back in the early days of Mark Spector's comic book appearances, he was basically a schizophrenic guy. He couldn't differentiate between reality and fantasy. Ultimately, that schizophrenia went away, and he ended up just having dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder. You may know it as that name as well, but basically having multiple personalities inside of his own mind. And so the way this worked, and what was really cool about this, what I really loved, is they were kind of toying with this idea that maybe Mark Spector really is crazy. He's just a guy in an asylum. Now, again, because of the fact that there wasn't a whole lot of time devoted to this, it felt a little bit like an afterthought, if that's what they were going for. But if you were looking at it and really kind of taking it for what it was like, okay, something bigger is going on here. This isn't simply just like, Marvel Studios being like, actually, Mark Spector's crazy. It wasn't really them doing that. Thank God. But all the little symbology, right? So like the staff of Arthur Harrow was basically there, but it was just a regular cane. Of course, he was wearing those sandals that he normally puts glass in, which isn't necessarily the case. While he does look different, he doesn't look like a hippie just tripping on LSD. Of course, he still has the limp, which is cool. And then you basically get the orderlies. Now, as soon as that happened, I kind of had a feeling that this was basically like Jeff Lemire's, whole Mark Spector in an insane asylum run. I kind of had a feeling that was the case, but as soon as I saw the orderlies, I was like, okay, I know what's going on here now. So here's what's happening so far, or at least in this tail end. So in Jeff Lemire's run, this is why I say they're doing it the opposite way. In Jeff Lemire's run, this is actually how it opened up. That basically Mark Spector was in an insane asylum. And the whole idea was being teased here that in reality, Mark Spector was just crazy. Like he was just a guy who was literally insane. And that was basically it. There wasn't really anything more to it than that. That you knew he had these kind of multiple personalities, that kind of thing. But as the story progressed, and as it got towards the end of the first arc, it was basically Mark coming to this realization mention that like the Steve Grant and the Jake Lockley and the Mark Spector personas, that he's largely just been ignoring them for too long. And what this did is it led to a fractured psyche. Now, the other part of this, and the way the story was initially pitched to us by Jeff Lemire, is this is actually what Khonshu would do. Because the whole insane asylum thing, that was all Khonshu's doing. That was basically him manipulating Mark Spector. And this is where the revelation came out that what Khonshu would do, and presumably other Egyptian god avatars, which may or may not have been the case since Khonshu is really the only one who's had an avatar for any real measure of time, that what would happen here is they would select a person to basically be their avatar on Earth. And as time went on, they would manipulate them, they would screw with their heads, and then ultimately they would launch this kind of end game where they would basically hollow out what was left of them to where that person would just be an empty shell with no real meaningful consciousness. And what that would do is it would basically allow Khonshu or any other Egyptian god to enter that host body and then walk on Earth, which presumably would mean that Mark Spector, in terms of personalities, Mark Spector, Steve Grant, Jake Lockley, they would be gone. They would basically be destroyed personalities. But Khonshu would still have all his power intact. So as far as we would see it as a comic book reader, it would basically be Mark Spector with like godlike powers. It would be really, really cool to see. What ended up happening shortly after that is writer Max Bemis came out and basically said, well, the whole intention of the entire Jeff Lemire run was to basically cure Mark of his mental illness, basically curing him of his dissociative identity disorder. And the idea was that over the course of that story, that Mark Spector basically came to terms with his other personalities. Instead of ignoring Jake Lockley and Steve Grant, he actually embraced them. And what it did is it led to a more cohesive version of Mark Spector himself. And then following that, they quote unquote symbolically killed Khonshu, which basically unified him and essentially fixed him of his dissociative identity disorder. And then following that, he just went forward as Mark Spector / Moon Knight and did his thing in the comics. It was really cool. Now, what you're seeing here, because what also happened in there is you ended up finding out that like Amit basically had a role in that, right? She was part of the whole illusion, all that kind of stuff. I would say that what they're doing here is they're borrowing from Jeff Lemire's run, but they're not doing it in its entirety. That the whole idea is that with Mark Spector basically being shot by Arthur Harrow and then waking up in this kind of purgatory, that Amit has no intention of seizing control of Arthur Harrow, of basically having him become her avatar. Instead, she's likely seeking out Mark Spector. And this whole sequence that you see going on here is basically Amit messing with Mark Spector, intending to basically quote unquote hollow him out, destroy his personalities, and then take his body for herself, and then be reborn in human form on Earth, and then have all these insane powers so she can conquer all of existence. So instead of being like the other Egyptian gods that have avatars, where they basically, use them as more of like communication vessels, as opposed to using them in the same way that like Khonshu uses Mark Spector as like an anti-hero / vigilante / Moon Knight type guy, that instead she'll quite literally operate here. Whether that means the other Egyptian gods will step in, I'm not entirely sure. We don't necessarily know here, but I would surmise that's most likely what's going on. Whether or not that's the case, only time will tell. But one big distinction to know here is, one, this is the first time that Mark Spector and Steve Grant are meeting face to face, as it were, right? Where they're actually two different personalities talking to each other. That's how you know it's in the mindscape, because they're physically able to embrace each other. It's exactly what happened in Jeff Lemire's run. But following that, there were two other cool things that happened here. The first one is we got a kind of depiction, or at least a little bit of a tease, of the Jake Lockley persona. Now again, in Marvel Comics, Jake Lockley is a cab driver who fights more like a brawler than anything else, but he's not nearly as trained, and he's not like a mercenary type guy like Mark Spector is. In the TV show, it looks totally different. It looks like, to some degree, Jake Lockley's like a psychopathic killer. I don't really know. Or he's just nuts. Who knows? Whatever it is, he seems incredibly capable and pretty brutal, right? Because we know in the last episode with those three guys, those three henchmen that were trying to attack him, that like Mark Spector passed out, or basically the personality switched. And then when he took back control again, he thought it was Steve Grant who had killed those guys. And so he's like, it wasn't me. me. So obviously there was a third person there, but that's never been the kind of person Jake Lockley is. So assuming it is Jake Lockley, they're changing him for the show, which I'm excited about because I always thought Jake Lockley was for the most part useless. So I'm really excited to see what they do with this character. I mean, right now, all we know is he's locked away in a sarcophagus. I don't think we heard his voice. We just saw, or just like saw him like pounding on the inside of the sarcophagus, and then they ignored him, and that was basically it. The real question is why they ignore him. Right, that's the question. Like, does Mark Spector know about Jake Lockley, at least on some level? Does Steve Grant know about him on like some level? Like, not in the sense that they're aware of his personality, but in the sense that like when they see that potential personality there, they just feel a kind of threat of imminent danger. So they're just like, stay away on a subconscious level. Like, you know how it is, like when you get that hair that comes up on your arms or something like that, and you're like, okay, something really bad's about to happen. That kind of feeling, right? Almost like a sort of spider sense to a degree. But the last thing we get is Tawaret, I think is how you pronounce it. I've always been really, really fuzzy about that. Basically the hippo goddess. She does not appear in the comics. First things first, she is not in Marvel Comics as far as I'm aware at all. And I'm fairly familiar with the different Egyptian gods and goddesses that exist out there. So I am not aware of her appearing there. It looks like they actually grabbed her from the real world Egyptian mythos and brought her into the TV show. Technically, she represents like life, death, rebirth, that kind of a thing, regeneration, so on and so forth. So in the show, she's likely a stand-in for the metaphysical point that Jeff Lemire was making, which is Moon Knight being reborn. That's basically what it is. If anything, she'll probably be the means by which Mark Spector reconciles his other personalities, particularly with Jake Lockley, and like, that's it, right? It may be one of these things where quite literally, they have a powwow. It's like the three of them sitting in a circle and they're all talking to each other and like figuring out what's going on. I have no real idea. I am excited to find out. I was a little on the fence about Moon Knight, right? I was like, God, it's a slow burn, Now it's really got my attention. It kind of sucks that we only got 2 episodes left, but it's really got my attention and I absolutely love it. I think it's only 6 episodes. So I'm really, really digging it so far. It took a little while to get to this point. I feel like we could have gotten to this point a little bit faster, but I also understood why they paced it the way that they did. Having said that, that's basically the ending, the whole sequence explained. In effect, what's happening here is Mark Spector's not really dead. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. He looks like he's more in like a mental purgatory, kind of stuck in his own mind is basically what it is. Like, most likely, he's still just laying there in the water and he's not dead yet. Arthur Harrow will likely end up just walking away, right? He'll take his henchmen and just leave, and he'll assume that Mark Spector's dead. And then like, his girl will like run up and save him or something like that. And so all this entire sequence will have taken place in the span of maybe like 30 seconds to a minute or something like that, or some other third aspect will come in. But basically he'll end up coming to and he'll still be alive, but his mind will be fixed is basically what it is. So with that being said, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think about episode 4, right? Let me know what you guys think about this episode, and I will catch you all later. Peace.